that if we believe that the G20 objective ought to be sort of at least restoring or making sure that these political disruptions do not disrupt the global economy. How do we restore trust in the global institutions? How do we reduce the tensions? Since you are the head of G20, Sujan, we expect you'll have all the answers for the G20.
Well, thank you, Rakesh. All these words that you mentioned are very potent, and for me personally, they are good points of inflection. You began by claiming that the age of globalization set in after the Second World War. To me, with a slightly sort of deeper analysis of history, I would say that the real age of globalization began in the age of discovery and in the age of colonization. For me, it is apparent that the four industrial revolutions have had very different impacts on what we refer to as globalization. All these very potent words such as trust, integrity, resilience, and rethinking globalization. The first industrial revolution for me, which gave rise to things like the locomotive and the steamship, were actually instruments that furthered globalization, but in a very colonial context. We must remember that India too was part of that terrain, which was globalized, but as a colony. The second industrial revolution, which gave rise to the manufacturing sector, in fact furthered this process of exploitation of resources, especially by the colonialists from their colonial possessions and dominions. The third industrial revolution gave some hope because it came with a different kind of manufacturing, low cost. It came with the advent of the information age and technology that allowed the traditional engines of global economic growth to shift from the West, from the United States and Europe towards Asia. And I think it was making for a level playing field. But I'm afraid the advent of the fourth industrial revolution, with the kind of emerging technologies that it is bringing in, quantum physics, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth, is actually once again creating the grounds for inequality and possible unequal growth, a possible exploitation of a very, very grim and different and serious kind. For me, therefore, there are essentially 6 T factors which are available as points of friction in all geographies today around the world. There is the T of trade, which we see is at the center and heart of conflict today and competition. But it's difficult to control because trade is fungible. Trade is not always in the hands of government. It is led by the private sector, by entrepreneurs, by traders, industrialists, which is why we see in an era of major power contestation that US-China trade, US-Japan trade, US-India trade continues to grow, but China-India trade, China-US trade, China-Australia trade, China-Japan trade also continues to grow. Technology, the second T, is also at the heart of contestation, but easier to control because technology is usually high-end when it comes to export restrictions and sanctions, etc. And therefore, governments are better able to legislate the exports of technologies. The third T is the T of territorial contestation, which is also at the heart of what is the current discourse in Europe as well as in the Indo-Pacific. The fourth T is that of terrorism, because this is something that fundamentally questions peace and progress everywhere today. No peace and progress, no stability, you cannot have economic growth. The fifth T is that of tenets and narratives, which is again at the heart of major power contestation. Whose narrative, whose system of governance, economic, political, social, cultural, is superior? Is it the democratic model? Is it the liberal trading order? Is it the state-led capitalism of the type practiced by China? and this goes on. The sixth factor also, which is common to all geographies, is trust or the utter lack of it. Today, therefore, I would say that it is time to focus on making existing multilateral institutions more resilient. They are weakened, they are underperforming, but it is difficult to do without them as well. We have seen how the United Nations has proved ineffective and impotent in the face of major situations around the world. It has not been reformed for a very long time. In fact, the only time it was touched was in 1965 when the ECOSOC had passed a resolution 4 years earlier in 1961. It took another 4 years to actually implement that decision to expand the non-permanent category from 6 to 10, taking the total number of Security Council members from 11 to 15. And we haven't seen any change since then. When you look at the Bretton Woods institutions, the international financial institutions, or the MDBs, you see a similar problem there. In fact, I know that you are an expert in these matters, but I do want to point out that as far as the IMF is concerned, it accounts only for around 950 billion dollars worth of special drawing rights, which is only 1% of the global economy. And in that you see that only 40% roughly is actually special drawing rights controlled by the developed countries, and about 60% is actually indirectly controlled through what you call new arrangements, bilateral arrangements to borrow, etc. So it is lopsided from the very beginning. Any change requires 85% of the vote. If the United States of America, a single country, has 17.5% of voting rights there, you can realize that there is a veto in place. When you look at the World Bank, for instance, you cannot do anything without, for instance, congressional approval. So I think we are at a stage where we have to not only try and reinvigorate the existing system, but also to fundamentally reform it. Thank you.